I want to speak about the fundamental breakdown of the monetary system. Now, as, as a race, humanity has spent its entire history lying to itself about how money works. We're told that the money that you have is the number of zeros in your bank account. There's a fundamental flaw in that thinking. It works really well in the 90% in the middle. Where it breaks down is when you have very little money or very large amounts of money. When you have, on both ends of that wealth gap, the way that money functions is more about your percentage of the amount of money in the globe. So this is why we observe a very strange thing with extreme capitalists. People like Bezos, the people that have the vast majority of wealth. They become obsessed with gathering wealth, and as they gather wealth, they observe that the harder they work to gather wealth, the less and less wealth they get. I believe this is what Bill Gates has figured out, is that he worked really hard for his entire life to gather up all of the wealth. And at some point he decided to start calculating his wealth rather than as the number of zeros in his bank account, as a percentage of global wealth. And he realized that every year, instead of his wealth increasing, his wealth decreased. This is fundamental to how money works. It's been repeated over history. The Romans figured it out. The Greeks figured it out. The Muslims figured it out. The Chinese figured it out. Whether or not they communicated it to their populations is another story. I believe this is what the long history of prophets and philosophers was about. They're all saying the same thing. They're saying that the amount of money does not matter. The amount of money that you accumulate in your lifetime is largely irrelevant because it can all be taken away with a stroke of a pen. I presume that what happened in these societies as the prophets rose was that the prophets realized that the people who were the most wealthy had the most to lose in these wealth redistribution games. And they wanted to talk to the people and talk to the wealthy and say, wealth redistribution will happen whether you like it or not. There's ways to get around it and there's ways to prolong it, but it will happen and you need to decide what to do about it. Now, in the past, we've solved these wealth redistribution crises in various ways. In some instances, humanity acted very poorly, tried to expand their ability to produce things by taking over other countries, by enslaving people. We're now at the point where we've pretty much enslaved as many people as we can, and developed civilizations do not have an appetite for further enslavement. We've pretty much colonized the entire world, and we're running out of places to colonize. And it's becoming more and more expensive to colonize places, because colonizing places requires force, and force becomes more and more expensive as it gets harder and harder to do. So we can pour all the rest of our resources into a giant army to enslave the rest of humanity. If we want to. If we choose to, it's a choice. Or we can voluntarily share the wealth, figure out how many resources the people in your countries need, how many resources people in other countries need to be productive, so that we can lift the productivity of the entire world. We can choose where we land on all of these questions. There's no black and white in this solution. You don't have to choose between keeping all the wealth distributed the same way and ending world poverty. Those are the two extreme choices, and you can choose something right in the middle somewhere. You don't have to end world poverty, you don't have to create free energy through renewable resources straight away. You can choose to make an incremental step to do things that improve the quality of life of humanity. And it can be on a small scale, it can be in communities, it can be in countries, but that's the way that it has to go, because the other choices are enslavement of all labour and complete destruction of society and the ecosystem. Now, I don't particularly want capitalism to end. I think capitalism has been a fantastic innovation, but we need to recognise it for what it is. It's an innovation in the way that we handle money. What it does, because of the fractional banking system, is it amplifies the power of capital. If you have wealth, then it's very easy to generate more wealth. As a society, we can't just continue incentivizing collecting wealth for the sake of collecting wealth. We need to provide the incentive structure so that the wealth that has already been accumulated is used to further the goals of humanity. As countries, as communities, as a society in general, we can decide what the incentive structure is. If we wanted to say our incentive structure has changed, we're no longer interested in the current incentive structure, and we would like to change it. We don't need to do that by destroying capital. We don't need to burn down the companies that built the world. We don't need to destroy all the CEOs. They're not the problem. They acted in the best interests of themselves and in the best interests of humanity. The problem is with the societies in which these companies functioned, not with the companies themselves. When the oil companies were created, providing enough fuel to fuel global progress was a huge issue. When the companies that turned into the giant food producers we currently have, when they were created, a big problem with society was that there was not enough food and people starved to death. We need to take a clear-eyed look at what is limited in our societies and retain as many of those resources as possible for as long as possible. Mindless consumption is done. It ended 3 months ago. We now need to change the paradigm and have a good think about what we value, how long we would like humanity to last on this planet, and act accordingly. I'm not saying consumption finishes tomorrow. I'm saying consumption, rather than continuing to go up and up and up and up, we need to turn the ship around and start reducing it. We don't need to turn it from excessively overconsumption into underconsumption overnight. We need to find the rate at which consumption is sustainable. So we reduce consumption by a little bit. I'm not saying you won't be able to access televisions anymore. I'm not saying you won't be able to access electronics anymore. I'm not saying you won't be able to access cars anymore. And it won't change overnight, but if we do not change it and we do not start changing it in small ways, then it will continue to grow until it destroys everybody. This is how this plays out in the long term, in game theory terms. We have a golden opportunity to renegotiate the social contract, and it behooves all of us to engage honestly and clearly with that. I believe the underlying issue with the system that we've been running is how fast the wealth diverts. The wealth gap is an obvious problem, and unfortunately, the only way that I've heard people explain it to other people is that we need to take the wealth from the wealthy and forcibly give it to the poor. This is clearly a nonsense, and it's clearly threatening to the wealthy. What we need to do is communicate clearly what is going on right now with world currencies to the most wealthy. There's a fundamental gap in understanding between wealth and riches. The number of dollars in your bank account does not matter. What matters is your percentage of the wealth of the entire world. If that is going up, you're becoming more wealthy. If it's going down, you're becoming less wealthy. I suspect this is what the people in the very top have figured out and what the people in the next 10% have not figured out. The next 10% is worried about balance sheets. They're worried about making the number go up. They haven't turned their minds to the fact that if their number doesn't go up at a larger rate than the number of extra money being pumped into the system, and it gets pumped in by private banks when they loan money, and it gets pumped into the system by governments when they provide government services. If your wealth isn't increasing as a percentage, then it's decreasing. The wealth gap is already closing, we just haven't communicated it clearly to everybody. We saw a huge demonstration of this when world governments printed a whole bunch of money to deal with the current situation in the world. This was necessary because one of the important things to keep the world functioning is to have a population that exists, hasn't died, and hasn't gone insane. The risk of having everyone go insane from lack of economic resources is real, and we need to engage with it properly. The risk of the world population dying from lack of economic activity is real, and we need to engage with it. It is possible for people to lose access to food and healthcare and die as a result. That is a thing that happens, and we need to engage with it properly. What we don't need to do is get mad at the governments for printing money. The problem is not with governments printing money. They didn't cause the deflation and inflation of the currencies. A lack of liquidity in the system caused the inflation and deflation of currencies. We can fake liquidity by printing money and injecting liquidity where it's needed. This is basically changing the oil in the engine. The engine is still working and it still does the same thing. We just made it work again when it's seized up. We're now at the point where the engine has completely seized up in all systems. Now, it's very easy to say, oh, that's just because supply and demand broke down. Well, if that was all that happened, and it was because of a virus, then we wouldn't have significant portions of the academic economics community and the investment community screaming out that there's a global liquidity crisis in all sectors, and it's getting worse, and it's getting worse exponentially, and we might only have a few years of this current monetary system to run. They're going to change the money. That's going to happen. Money has stopped making any sense, and we will slowly realize that. World governments are currently doing an excellent job maintaining the price of goods, making sure that companies that supply those goods are continuing to be subsidized so that they can continue to pay workers, and so that the whole system doesn't stop. This has an end date, though. There's no possibility to keep the system afloat without completely devaluing all world currencies. And we need to engage with this idea and what it looks like on the other side of the complete devaluation of all currencies. Now, I personally hope that we manage to get through this crisis without all world currencies losing their value entirely, because that creates a huge amount of disruption to the productive capacity of human beings on a world scale. It won't break down everywhere at once, but if America breaks down and their currency system stops working, that will cascade around the globe, and all currency systems will stop working, because the American dollar is the main way that we determine the value of trade. So what I'm proposing is, let's critically engage with the idea that the monetary system might be breaking down, because it looks like it is. If you're in finance, there's a half a chance that you've looked at all the opportunities around and all you've seen is bubbles, and so you've made the logical conclusion that you need to put all your money in gold. It's debatable. Perhaps gold is the only sane investment at the moment, but there's every chance that gold is largely inflated in price due to lack of liquidity in the system in general. So my thoughts personally are, there is no safe harbor in this situation. Now, I'm not saying that society will dismantle. People will still be fed, and people have a stock of extra food. There's a little buffer in the system, but we have very little buffer in the system. So this is an emergency. We don't need to dismantle all systems overnight. We don't need to destroy all the progress that we've made. All we need to do is think about what incentives we want businesses to work towards and incentivize those behaviors, and provide a slight disincentive to continue to do things that are destructive, while at the same time propping up the companies that have been doing destructive things. Give them time to transition into doing something that is productive, and if they choose not to take that transition opportunity, we need to call it a day. The really obvious low-hanging fruit for doing this are the financial sector, the fossil fuel sector, and the giant farming sector. They need to be provided with an opportunity to transition into something sustainable, and we need to acknowledge the good work that they have done for the last 100 years. That's imperative. It's not their fault that they continued to follow the incentive structure that had broken down. Yes, they did subvert government to try and make their profits continually go up, but the harder they tried to make their profits go up, the more and more people they cut out of the economy, and their profits went down. It was counterproductive, and they know it, and they're desperate, and they need a solution. They can't see a solution because the only thing they know how to do is maximize profits. We need to provide them a way out, because they're backed into a corner, and we need to recognize that. If we offer them a way out and a transition scheme, I believe they will take it. I further believe that that is the only opportunity for humanity to make a better society moving forward. This is a really scary time. These breakdowns of the monetary system are all really scary. Everyone gets stressed out. Everyone acts poorly. We need to accept that and not assign blame. Every single person and company and government is acting badly and in self-interest. That's fine. That happens. What we need to do is accept that and move on. This is the same problem that caused the fall of Rome, that caused the 2 world wars, that caused inflation in the 70s. We haven't figured out a good solution for it because we always try to patch up the problems and keep going. Instead of patching up the problems this time, let's have a look around, let's decide what we would like society to do, and let's slowly reorganize society to do the thing that we would like it to do. Yes, there will be waste. We will have companies that continue to act badly if we don't communicate what is going on to them clearly. They will take our money, and we will have to devalue the currency to get the money back. And they will take our money again, and we will have to punish them and say, please stop taking all the money. We're going to take it from you, whether it's directly or via inflation, so why don't you take our opportunity that we give you to reform, and reform. Otherwise, your company is going away. You can live out the rest of your life with the wealth you've accumulated, but that wealth is coming back to the middle. All formulations of this idea that I've heard recently require a giant tax on the most wealthy and a giant subsidy to the least wealthy. What I'm proposing is that we do the same thing that we've done every time that capitalism has had this problem. We take out a loan against the future, and then we do the work to build a better future that can pay back that loan. Now, you've heard, of course, giant arguments about what happens when governments run giant deficits. They have to pay it back. They're going to go into debt to China, etc., etc., etc. That's simply not the way that government money works. That's the way that company money works. That's not the way that government money works. The largest deficits ever run in humanity were not most recently as a percentage of GDP. In fact, the deficits that are run now are the smallest deficits in the history of the world. The biggest ones were during World War I and during World War II. Huge world deficits in government spending to fight wars. What we realized at the end of those wars was that it doesn't make any sense to go hugely into debt in order to destroy the capital production capacity of the earth. It just causes us to go backwards instead of going forwards. There's a huge risk that we do that again this time, but this time we have the capacity to do it in a mushroom cloud kind of way. So, to de-escalate that chance and that risk, we need to protect as much capital investment as has been made. We need to restructure the incentives, tell the finance sector that they did a fantastic job. Thank you very much. You can take the foot off the pedal now. You can assign capital in a way that makes sense for humanity and society instead of a way that makes sense for you. We need to talk to all these industries and ask them to work together and in the benefit of society to create a better society that can continue to pay the interest requirements of the debt that we will have to go into to fix this problem. Tightening your belts doesn't work. We saw this at the end of World War II. We saw huge amounts of poverty and destruction and saving money in order to try and build a better world. As soon as we decided that this is madness and we're going to just pay for it now and inflate away the debt, we fixed society in a matter of 1 decade, even less. We fixed society very, very quickly, as soon as we spent the money to fix society. And even though we took on the largest amount of debt in the history of the world, there was never a large debt repayment by a government. The inflation just slowly ate away at the debt. Everyone was happy, society was reformed, we got a new level of prosperity. The people that bought the government bonds in order to fund this restructure of society, they were able to access a world of opportunity and investment again. They didn't care that much about the government bonds. The government bonds were just seen as a retirement strategy. It was small money to make sure that you have a small retirement. The big money was made in investing in new industries, new ways of doing business, new highly profitable structures. This is the way forward, everybody. We can continue to do fractional reserve banking. We just need to take a rational view of how much debt we would like the banks to be in. We need to recognize that fractional reserve banking grows exponentially, and we need to look at what the fraction of debt to assets is and work with banks to make sure it doesn't blow out of proportion. Banks need to be responsible lenders towards things that better society. They don't need to be worried about making maximum returns. That will happen naturally. They don't need to be worried about making sure that no one wastes any money. Waste will happen. We need to reduce waste. We don't need to do it pathologically. Societies always get completely psychotic when they reach this point. They make poor decisions. They get obsessed with looking for waste everywhere except for under their own bed. We need to communicate these ideas clearly because, quite frankly, the continuation of human society is at risk. You have two options. You can either pray that a new technology comes along to boost productivity 1,000 times. That doesn't look like it's happening fast enough. You can pin your hopes on someone very rich figuring out how to colonize Mars in the next 10 years, and that they want to take you along, or we can fix the mess that we find ourselves in. Let's honestly engage with what the work that needs to be done to fix the system is. I suspect that it just requires an adjustment of attitudes, not a vast adjustment of policy. We can just give people food in most Western countries and not let them starve. We're demonstrating doing it right now. We can make sure that people don't lose their houses. We can make sure that all of these safety nets are in place while we restructure humanity. But it doesn't make sense to do the safety nets without restructuring how society functions and making society work for people rather than people work for society. Thank you for engaging. I'm going to keep talking about this idea because I think that it's the most important idea in the history of humanity. Not my formulation of this idea, but the work that's already been done by prophets and philosophers in the past. We need to wake up. We need to honestly engage with what the problem really is. We need to stop pointing fingers and assigning blame. There's no one to blame. This is just how money works. Please ask someone that has a better idea of economics than you. Ask them what the percentage of their wealth versus world wealth is, and see if it's increased or decreased in the span of their lifetime. They might have added a bunch of zeros to their bank account, but if world governments added a whole bunch of extra zeros, their wealth went down. That's not a bad thing. That's how society functions. We need money to keep circulating, and the money's stopped circulating. So while it's stopped, let's have a look at what we're doing and choose to do it better. Thank you.